We know. Dr. Mercer's voice was perfectly calm when he said it. The voice of a man who had rehearsed this conversation more than once in his head and was relieved he no longer had to. I asked about Catherine. He told me Elliot had been up front during the negotiation. He said the marriage had been over for years, that she lived in Portland, and the missing divorce paperwork was just a formality he'd been putting off. I asked if they had verified any of that. Mrs. Mercer looked down at her hands. Dr. Mercer said, "He saved my life," I said. "He bought your daughter." The room went completely ice cold. Mrs. Mercer said softly, "We didn't see it that way. We saw a man who loved Cassidy enough to do something extraordinary. The money, that was his way of showing us who he was." I looked at the contract between us. The document says otherwise. Your daughter doesn't know she's repaying a debt. She doesn't know she can't legally marry him. Dr. Mercer set down his tea. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered. His voice, when it came, was different than it had been a second earlier. He said, "She is not going to know." I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "She is not going to know. Not from us. Not from you." I said, "I'm her best friend." He said, "Then act like it." I drove back to Chicago on I-88 without turning on the radio. I want to tell you that I made my decision on that drive. That I knew, by the time I crossed back into Cook County, what I was going to do. I didn't. I went back and forth every single day for the next 6 weeks. I called a lawyer in the loop who confirmed the bigamy laws in Illinois. She told me plainly, if Elliot didn't dissolve that Arizona marriage, Cassidy would stand in a room full of people in a beautiful dress, and she wouldn't legally be his wife. She would just walk back down the aisle as Catherine Reyes-Rowe's husband's girlfriend. The lawyer asked me if my friend knew. I said no. The lawyer was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Whatever you decide, decide soon. After the ceremony, the law gets more complicated. Before it, you still have a window." I thanked her and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table on North Clark Street for a long time after that. I started watching Cassidy the way you watch someone you're about to lose. She came over on a Thursday in March, 3 weeks before the wedding, with a folder of seating charts and a question about whether her cousin from Madison should be at table 7 or table 11. She was wearing the engagement ring. She was glowing. She said, "I keep waiting for the panic. Everyone says you panic before the wedding. I'm not panicking." I said, "Maybe that's a good sign." She said, "Maybe that's the sign." She looked at me carefully then. She had known me for 19 years, and she could read my face better than anyone alive. She said, "Are you okay? You've been weird." I said, "I'm just tired." She didn't believe me. I could see her decide not to push. She said, "I'm so glad you'll be standing up there with me." She hugged me at the door. I held on a second too long, she noticed. After she left, I sat on my couch and cried for the first time since February. Liam called me the next morning. His voice was low. "She mentioned you to my mother. She said you seemed off. She asked if anything had happened between us." I didn't say anything. He said, "If you're thinking about telling her, don't." I said, "Liam." He said, "She is happy, for the first time in years, with everything Dad has been through. She is happy. You take that from her, and what do you replace it with?" I said, "The truth." He said, "The truth doesn't pay for chemotherapy." I said, "It doesn't undo bigamy either." There was a pause. He said, "Elliot filed the Arizona paperwork. His attorney sent confirmation last week." I said, "And you believe him?" He said, "I have to." I tried to find the Arizona filing myself. I called the Maricopa County Superior Court on a Wednesday afternoon. I gave them the case parameters: Catherine Reyes Rowe, Elliot Rowe, dissolution, 2024 to present. There was no filing. I called again on Friday. I gave the clerk Elliot's full legal name and date of birth. There was no filing. I sat with the phone in my hand and I thought, he lied to them too. Or he hadn't lied. He had simply waited. Because in his calculation, the wedding was the leverage. The marriage couldn't be dissolved until the new one was secured. He needed Cassidy walking down that aisle before Catherine became inconvenient. I had 2 weeks left. I almost told her on a Tuesday. We were at a bridal fitting in a shop on Oak Street. She was standing on a small wooden platform in front of 3 mirrors, in a dress that had been altered 4 times to fit her exactly. The seamstress had stepped out to get pins. We were alone in the room. Cassidy looked at herself in the mirror. She turned. She looked again. She said, "I never thought I'd get here. I really didn't. After what Dad went through, for a while I thought our whole family was just going to be defined by that. By the cancer. By waiting." She turned to face me directly. She said, "Elliot pulled us out of that. I don't know what we would have done without him. I don't know who we would have become." She was smiling. I opened my mouth. I felt the words form. "Cassidy, there's something you need to know." The seamstress walked back in with the pins. Cassidy turned back to the mirror. The moment passed. I told myself I would tell her that night. I told myself I would tell her the next morning. I told myself a lot of things in those last 2 weeks. The night before the wedding, Elliot found me. I was at the rehearsal dinner at a steakhouse in Naperville. I had stepped outside to get air. He came out 5 minutes later. He was holding a glass of water. He said, "You've been quiet tonight." I said, "I'm tired." He said, "Cassidy mentioned you've seemed distant for a few months." I didn't say anything. He looked at me for a long time. He was 41, and tall, and controlled, and the kind of man who speaks quietly because he's learned that quiet men get listened to more carefully. He said, "I know you talked to Liam." I felt the cold go up the back of my neck. He said, "I know you went to see Cassidy's parents in February." I said nothing. He said, "I want you to understand something. I love her. Whatever you think you've figured out, whatever shape you think this has, I love her, and tomorrow she is going to walk down that aisle, and she is going to be happy. And the version of events where that happens is the only version that matters." I said, "She doesn't know." He said, "She doesn't need to." He looked at me, and his expression did not change, and he said, "You've had 6 months to tell her. You haven't. We both know why." He went back inside. I stood in the parking lot for 20 minutes. He was right. I'd had 6 months. I'd had the documents, the lawyer's number, the lie about Arizona, and a key to her apartment. And every time I had picked up the phone, I had thought about Dr. Mercer alive in that living room, holding a cup of tea. I had thought about Cassidy on the wooden platform in the bridal shop, looking at herself, saying I never thought I'd get here. I had told myself I was protecting her by waiting. I think now I was protecting myself. Because if I told her, and she went through with it anyway, which she might have, I would have to know that too. I would have to live with a version of my best friend who chose this with full information. And some part of me, the small, ugly part one am only now admitting to, did not want to know which Cassidy she was. It was easier to let her be the Cassidy who didn't know. I stood at the front of the room at Salvatore's banquet hall in Naperville the next afternoon. I was wearing a champagne-colored dress, holding a bouquet that felt like lead. The room was full of 200 people. Some of them knew everything. Some of them knew pieces. Most of them knew nothing at all. Cassidy didn't know anything. I watched her walk down the aisle on her father's arm. Dr. Mercer was crying. Cassidy was smiling. Mrs. Mercer was watching her husband walk their daughter toward the man who had paid for him to be able to do it. Elliot was waiting at the altar. As she reached him, he took her hands. He looked at her face, really looked at her. And his expression was the expression of a man who had won something he had been working toward for a very long time. Then he looked up, past Cassidy, straight into my eyes. He held the look for one full second, long enough for me to understand that he knew exactly what I had not done, long enough for me to understand that my silence had been part of the contract from the beginning, long enough for me to understand that the calculation had included me and that he had calculated correctly. The officiant said, "Do you take this man?" Cassidy said, "I do." She looked happy. That's the part one still think about. I went home to Chicago that night, and I did not sleep. I have not seen Cassidy in person since the wedding. We text. She sends pictures. She is, by every visible measure, fine. She and Elliot bought a house in Hinsdale. Dr. Mercer is still in remission. Last Christmas, she sent a card that said, "We're thinking about kids next year." I have started and deleted the same message to her 47 times. I don't know if I'm waiting for the courage to tell her, or waiting for the moment when telling her would do more harm than good, or waiting for her to figure it out on her own so I don't have to be the one. I don't know if any of those moments are ever going to come. I don't know if she would forgive me. For knowing. For not telling. For standing at the front of that room in a champagne-colored dress and watching her say yes to a contract she had never read. I don't know if I would forgive me either. But I know this. Somewhere in a house in Hinsdale, my best friend is making coffee in a kitchen her husband paid for, in a marriage her father signed for, in a life she does not know the shape of. And every time my phone buzzes, I think, this is it. This is the day she found out. It hasn't been, yet. But the Arizona filing was never made. Catherine Reyes Rowe is still legally somebody's wife, and one day, a year from now, 5 years, 10, some piece of paper, some background check, some old friend at a bar in Scottsdale is going to put it in front of her. And on that day, she is going to remember that I was at her wedding, that I stood there in a champagne-colored dress, that I held the bouquet, that I said nothing. Subscribe for the next case. Don't look away.